the mortal fear of the government censor. And not the government censors alone. As Prof pointed out, the film consultative panel, which the government earnestly consulted, made its own fear crystal clear. An overwhelming 20 members out of 24 declared the film must be banned. The official jargon in Singapore is NAR, not allowed for all rating, none of the rating, which means effectively it's banned. So it is not just a civil service decision. It is a decision based on the strong recommendation of what is called community representation. And I think that's very important to bear in mind. So the central question is, do such scenes or films pose a major threat to racial harmony? Is this a reasonable fear, or is it entirely an imagined one? Now, every government has its own fears and its own assumed sensitivities. No government is exempt from this. Now, to go back to history again, one of the most liberal Western democracies, Sweden, is said to have introduced a constitution which abolished censorship. You know when? 1766. They say it was the first such country, European country, to do so. Yet, Sweden did have a film censorship board established in 1911. And it's still there. Except the role has changed, mostly to do what we are doing here, which is classification. But if you think in Sweden films are not banned or cut, think again. They did. But the last one was done in 1995, and the film would surprise many Singaporeans. It was Martin Scorsese's Casino. And what were the scenes that were cut? Some people were bashed up by baseball bats and buried alive. Now that was too brutal for the Swedish censor. She said, no, this won't do, right? I think in Singapore, we seem to take violence in our own stride. We are kind of mature in that way, but we can't do sex. We are not mature in that way. At least that seems to be the view of some of our policymakers. However, more specifically with reference to Ken Kwek's film, we should note that Sweden too has a regulation against hate speech. In fact, most of Europe has very strong and very specific regulations about hate speech, which prohibit not only the kind of outrageous statements, and the word used is that threaten or express disrespect. This is the exact word. Disrespect for any group regarding their race, color, faith, or sexual orientation. In fact, in the last 10 years, many European countries are tightening up this regulation in the light of what you already heard, It used to be only the Jews should not be insulted. But now, many European countries have become more inclusive in that sense. Therefore, Singapore is not alone or particularly finicky in its outlook of critical speech. However, it is pretty obvious that these countries differ in the way they formulate the rules and how they implement. And implementing in a multitude of contexts, and that's the critical point that I'm going to come to. Now, to my mind, that's precisely where our public discourse should focus on. Not whether there should be total freedom or no censorship, but how the limitations of free speech need to be developed and applied in the Singapore context. The Singapore government had long refused to settle for the classification and community moderation system, claiming that the government had to do what was right. It took decades to change its stand. However, the government will claim, as it often does, that it is merely responding to changing public norms. Even in this particular case, this is the exact word. In classifying films, we seek to reflect prevailing community standards. We do not attempt to push the boundaries beyond what the community is prepared to accept, nor seek to defend a status quo when the community has moved past it. This is the government position. Now, how does the government know what exactly does the community want? And is there just one particular marker of acceptance for the whole community? And even if it is the majority view, should that always prevail over minority views? Now, these and other such questions need to be discussed thoroughly, which I don't think is the case. Then we need to address a particularly tricky question. Most people understand they have a right not to be offended. For example, many members of the public don't want nudity to be thrust into their face in the shopping malls or in the newspapers, television, and so on and so on. But if we classify films and provide an advisory about the nudity content, do they still have a right to walk into those theaters and say, I am offended? Surely not. If that is the case for nudity, should we not apply similar contextual parameters for corrosive or hurtful speech? Is all corrosive speech unacceptable at all times and in all places? Now, there are indeed some things that I think you will agree with me that are unacceptable anytime, any place, such as child pornography, or, to add a little bit of drama, cannibalism. I don't think any one of you and I would indulge in child pornography or cannibalism just because, oh, the state prohibits it. We just won't do it because it is so revolting to us as human beings, as normal human beings. But on the other hand, adult pornography and eating meat are indulged by millions and millions of people around the world. So there are situations in which some are acceptable at all times and some are not acceptable at all times. And then there are some things that are acceptable only regarding time and space. So we come back to the question of corrosive or hate speech and its context. Now, there are several contexts in which such speech must be measured. And I want to suggest just a few. Is the speech inciting violence or hate? Then there would be a good case to prohibit it. Is the speech commonplace, such as the numerous prejudicial and pejorative terms that all of us have heard most of the life, and some of you have referred to it already, and it is merely repeated, by the characters in the film, and the sting from the speech doesn't have the same shock value because we've heard it over and over again. It's not really new, right? If the speech is always directed at just one ethnic group and not at any other throughout this film, then that would certainly be seen as a concerted attack on that group. If the speech is uttered as a very recent, even though prejudiced, but in a very persuasive manner as an argument, as opposed to the kind of throwaway lines, that we see in this film, there could be a case for some circumspection. Just as an example, if we had a character like Professor Tommy Koh is made to, put a very recent argument why Indians or Malays are subhuman, now that would be dangerous. In fact, Adolf Hitler did that with a lot of professors. Now that would be something that we will say, not on, right? If the speech is ultimately aimed at hurt and not humor or satire, which is the point you made just now, then there is reason to circumscribe it. If the speech has no redeeming